October 2008 came in dry and bright south of Concordia, and Roy Mercer rolled into the co-op lot, looking like a man one payment away from selling tools. His 1997 Ford F-25 coughed once before idling smooth, its rocker panels rusted through in two long orange scars, odometer reading 300 thou, 12,004 miles, tailgate held straight by a chain on the right hinge. He climbed out in patched brown overalls, faded seat cap and boots stitched twice at the toe, then stood in line with a folded parts list and a coffee can of bolts to match. Men in cleaner jackets looked him over, made room without speaking, and quietly sorted him into the category they used for hard years and bad luck. A clerk later remembered that two different people asked whether Roy was still renting or whether he had already started selling parcels. No one asked Roy directly. They did not need answers when appearances gave them one. The arithmetic they did not see sat in a metal box under his kitchen desk and in treasury bills laddered through a regional bank, 640 owned acres, 160 rented acres, 0 operating debt, no equipment notes, and 6 years of average input costs set aside. His annual household spending target for 2008 was $28,460, and he finished the year at $27,913. Power and heat, $3,980. Groceries, $6,740. Fuel for personal driving, $1,220. Clothing, $410. Church and local giving, $2,600. Property taxes and insurance on the house, $4,965. The rest went where it always went. Repairs first, reserves second. By the second week of October, the same men who assumed he was fragile were discussing fertilizer prepay at rising prices and renewing lines at 7.25%. Roy paid cash for his fall needs and drove home with worn gloves on the seat and no lender waiting on his yield. His rule book did not come from a seminar. It came from Reno County in 1985, from a day with wind sharp enough to cut through denim, when auction signs were tied to fence posts on his father's 320 acres. The note had been variable. It reset upward again and again until the rate hit 19.75%. What looked manageable at 9% became unworkable in less than 2 seasons. Gross crop income fell, interest expense rose, and every renewal stole another piece of breathing room. Roy was 21, old enough to read the numbers and young enough to think effort could still outrun math. He watched his father try it anyway. They sold a grain truck first, then a second tractor, then breeding stock. The debt balance barely moved. Interest consumed each partial payment and left the principal standing there like a post in concrete. At the final accounting before auction, they owed $412,700 on land and equipment with no realistic path to refinancing. Good people attended that sale. Good people bought what was listed. No one celebrated. That afternoon lodged deep and stayed there. Years later, Roy would summarize it in 3 lines and then go back to work. Never finance depreciating equipment. Never borrow against land equity for lifestyle. Never let a good crop year inflate fixed costs. He did not print those rules. He lived them in ledger columns. He started small and plain. In 1987, he rented 80 acres on shares and cleared $9,640 after all direct costs. In 1988, he added 120 acres and netted $14,210 through a mixed year. In 1989, after setting aside $21,000 in cash reserves, he bought his first owned parcel, 76 acres at $620 per acre, total $47,120, paid with cashier's checks and one short private note retired in 18 months. While neighbors discussed bigger lines and newer cabs, Roy tracked cost per acre by hand each winter and circled any line that drifted upward faster than yield. His kitchen table became an operating center and, in a quiet way, a tribunal. Oak top scarred by decades, one corner darkened by a lamp base, coffee ring from 1992 still visible near the calculator. He balanced columns there after supper: seed, chemistry, diesel, repairs, crop insurance, custom hauling, storage shrink. If a cost rose without a matching return, it went under review. If it failed review twice, it was cut or renegotiated. He did not hate spending. He hated unclear return. Auction yards taught him patience. In 1994, he bought a 1974 John Deere 4430 for $11,200 cash. Straight frame, weak hydraulics, tired wiring, but sound engine block and transmission. He parked it in the West Bay and rebuilt it over 12 winters, never forcing a rushed season repair with borrowed money. Parts total across those years came to $6,840. Some winters it got only a few evenings of attention. Some winters he did a full subsystem, one receipt clipped to the next. By the time he was done, the tractor fit his operation better than any brochure machine could. The comparison mattered because local dealers were moving financed units aggressively. A common package in the late 1990s and early 2000s was a $96,000 tractor note at 8.4% over 7 years. Annual payment landed near $18,130. Total paid, about $126,910. Interest alone, roughly $30,910, before considering higher insurance, depreciation, and sales tax load. Roy's rebuilt 4430 cost $18,040 all in, then delivered 2 decades of service with annualized capital cost under $1,000. When someone joked that his cab belonged in a museum, he smiled once and asked what their payment book looked like in a low-price year. From 1998 forward, his discipline became easier to measure because his record stayed exact. He tracked not only totals but unit economics, fuel per acre, repair hours per 100 engine hours, input prepay discounts captured in December versus spot purchases in spring. In years when corn and soybean prices ran strong, he still paid himself the same modest household draw and swept surplus into 3 places: short-term treasury bills, land opportunity account, and tax reserve. In weak years, those reserves absorbed the shock, so operating choices stayed rational rather than desperate. He also watched peers take paths that looked reasonable in the moment. Dale Voss expanded with confidence during a high-price cycle and carried more leverage than he admitted publicly. Maria Gutierrez and her brother Eli studied irrigation options and wanted stability for their acres. Owen Pike believed newer iron would reduce downtime enough to justify the payment. None of them were reckless people. They were trying to secure their futures with the tools lenders and dealers said modern agriculture required. Roy did not lecture them. He sharpened pencils, turned wrenches, and kept lowering his break-even point. By harvest 2008, he could withstand price swings that would force painful choices for a heavily financed operation. Cash rent on the 160 rented acres was locked at fair terms because landowners trusted him to pay on time without drama. Input suppliers liked him because checks cleared. Mechanics respected him because he brought clean machines and clear symptoms. His reputation was not flashy, but it was bankable in the oldest sense of that word. At dusk that fall, after the co-op crowd had gone home, he wrote one more line in the ledger. Preserve optionality. It sounded abstract, but on a farm it meant concrete things. Keep debt low enough to sleep during storms. Keep machinery old enough to own outright and reliable enough to finish on time. Keep reserves deep enough that one bad season did not force a bad decision in the next. The men who judged him in the parking lot saw rust and patches. Roy saw control. He closed the ledger, set the pencil across the binding, and listened to the furnace kick on under the kitchen floor. The house was quiet except for that low fan hum and the soft tick of the wall clock above the pantry door. At 8:10 the next morning, he drove the rust-streaked Ford back to Concordia for a hydraulic coupler and a pair of gauge wheels, parked beside 3 polished pickups with chrome mirrors, and walked in carrying a lunch pail that had lost most of its paint. The sales floor conversation dipped when he crossed it. Not rude, just quick and measurable. 2 men in branded jackets were talking about preseason orders, and one of them said, with enough volume to travel, that old machinery was a tax problem waiting to happen. The other laughed and asked who still trusted 40-year-old tractors for spring work. Roy put the coupler on the counter, gave a part number from memory, and waited while the clerk found it in the system. Total ticket, $286.74 with tax. He paid with a debit card tied to operating cash, folded the receipt once, and placed it in the same pocket as last week's fuel slips. What they saw was patched cloth and repaired boots. What they missed was that his prepay discounts that winter had already locked in $14.60 per acre savings on fertilizer across 800 cropped acres, a $11,680 edge before a planter touched soil. They missed that he had turned down 2 separate machinery notes in the prior 5 years, one for $184,000 at 6.9%, and one for $236,000 at 5.8%, because each would have raised fixed annual outflow by more than his worst-case weather cushion. They missed that his farm could take a lean price year without selling an acre. By late March 2009, the county had settled into mud season, and Roy followed the same rhythm that had built him from fragile to durable. He started each week with a 1-page cash calendar. Monday, expected disbursements. Wednesday, reconciliation. Friday, reserve transfer, if grain checks had posted. His categories stayed narrow on purpose: operating, household, taxes, opportunistic land, and emergency. The discipline looked simple until one looked at 20 years of entries and noticed there were no panic swings, no months where lifestyle spending spiked because market prices were high, no years where machinery purchases outran retained earnings. That steadiness had another source besides the 1985 auction. In 1990, when he was still proving himself to landlords and input suppliers, an older farmer named Walter Keene let him rent 80 additional acres after a tenant moved away. Walter did not ask for a glossy business plan. He asked 2 things. Would Roy keep terraces maintained, and would rent arrive on the date agreed? Roy said yes to both and kept both. In a dry August, Walter found him replacing a broken sweep on a chisel plow after dark and said, "Most men borrow first and repair second." Roy answered, "Borrowings repair build to the future." Walter nodded once. That was the whole conversation. When Walter passed in 2003, his daughter auctioned machinery and offered the home quarter to a local investor, Group First. The group bid $1,420 per acre with financing contingencies. Roy offered $1,360 per acre, all cash, 30-day close, and signed a letter committing to maintain waterways and fence lines exactly as Walter had. The daughter took Roy's offer because certainty mattered more than the extra nominal price. 80 acres at $108,800 became one of his best long-cycle decisions. By 2016, that same ground had produced average annual net returns above $205 per acre after direct costs and had appreciated to valuation ranges that no one in 2003 thought realistic. He built that outcome through unglamorous arithmetic. From 2009 through 2015, he treated each season as a stress test rather than a victory lap. In 2009, he grossed $612,400 across corn, soybeans, and wheat rotations, netting $168,920 after all operating costs, insurance, and rent. He moved $90,000 to short-term treasuries and $40,000 to the land account, leaving the rest for taxes and repairs. In 2010, his net rose to $214,310, and he did not raise household draw by a dollar. In 2011, drought pressure cut yields and net fell to $122,640, but no supplier waited on payment and no lender meeting was needed because reserves covered timing gaps. In 2012, high commodity prices pushed net to $301,870. He treated it as temporary, not destiny. In 2013 and 2014, margins narrowed again, netting $149,500 and $136,240. In 2015, he finished at $118,760 and still entered winter with 6 years of baseline input coverage. His living pattern remained modest enough to look from the road like hardship. The farmhouse siding needed paint he kept postponing. The kitchen linoleum had a worn track between sink and table. He bought work shirts in bulk at end-of-season discounts and patched knees before replacing pairs. In 2012, his household total was $29,140. In 2013, it was $28,970. In 2014, it was $30,220 because a water heater and roof repair landed in the same quarter. In 2015, it slipped back to $28,880. He did not perform poverty. He priced comfort by durability and skipped display as a category altogether. At county auctions, he was equally plain and equally exact. A spring sale near Glasgow in 2011 offered a grain drill with worn openers and a bent marker arm. Dealer estimate for a comparable new unit with monitor package was $32,400 before delivery fees. Roy inspected bearings, checked meter wear, calculated parts at $1,180, and labor at his own winter rate, then bought the used drill for $3,700. All-in cost after repair, $4,996. It planted 14 seasons with minor annual service. The savings against financed replacement, once interest and insurance were counted, exceeded $34,000. He did not announce that to anyone. He wrote it in the ledger and moved to the next line. The same pattern governed his fleet. The 1974 John Deere 4430 stayed central, now paired with a 1981 planter bar, rebuilt in stages, and a 1990s combine, purchased from a bankruptcy lot at 42 cents on the dollar. His annual machinery capital burden averaged $38 per acre across the operation. Several nearby farms running late-model finance fleets were above $120 per acre before fuel and repair labor. That difference did not show up in coffee shop stories. It showed up in survival windows when weather and prices turned against them. In March 2016, that quiet model met its loudest public test. Trent Halverson drove up from Hutchinson in a new half-ton pickup with dealer plates still mounted, clean tires, and a folder of aerial maps printed on thick, glossy stock. He had a pressed shirt, polished belt buckle, and the brisk confidence of someone who sold land as future rather than soil. At the co-op table near the windows, in earshot of half a dozen regulars, he unfolded a map and tapped the river-bottom tract Roy had farmed for years. 220 acres. Planned bypass corridor nearby. Warehouse park interest from a development group. Offer price $3,600,000 or $16,364 per acre, contingent on rezoning sequence and infrastructure timelines. Trent framed it as rational certainty. Sell into peak speculative demand. Move proceeds into diversified income assets. Stop carrying weather risk for returns that could not compete with commercial conversion. He used urgency language, saying the window would not stay open, saying only sentimental attachment kept farmers in low-margin production when institutional money was ready to buy. Roy listened without interruption. His overalls were dusted at the knee from a morning repair, and one cuff had a frayed seam he had not stitched yet. He looked at the map, then at Trent, then back at the map. The room waited for either gratitude or defensiveness, because those were the usual responses when a large number entered the air. He gave neither. He said, "I plant beans where water remembers to stay." 9 words. No lecture. No drama. Then he walked to the desk, signed seed and fertilizer checks totaling $92,740 for that same bottom land, and asked whether the co-op had confirmed his preferred inoculant lot number. Trent stayed another 20 minutes, speaking with 2 men who nodded at his forecast and glanced toward the door where Roy had exited. The social verdict in that moment was predictable. Many read silence as inability to understand upside. A few read it as stubbornness. Only 1 or 2 considered that he might have already done the full-cycle arithmetic and declined for reasons hidden inside his own break-even structure. Before we go any further, if you want to see exactly how that decision played out, through floods, rate hikes, and a public auction, subscribe and stay with the story. Roy did not avoid the subject after that day. He just answered in numbers when asked directly. At a fuel stop in April, one neighbor said he was leaving millions on the table. Roy replied that gross offer price was not the same as risk-adjusted lifetime return, especially when rezoning and infrastructure delays sat outside the seller's control. He added that productive ground with reliable moisture, managed debt-free, generated annual optionality, a one-time speculative exit could not always replace after taxes, reinvestment friction, and market volatility. The neighbor shrugged and said that sounded cautious. Roy said cautious had kept the lights on through more than one cycle. Planning began the first week of May under steady winds from the southwest. He ran the 4430 at a measured pace, monitored seed depth behind every field turn, and stopped twice to clear residue from a row unit that had started dragging. At dusk he parked by the shop, greased zerks while the block was still warm, and logged fuel, acres, and minor repairs in pencil. The page for that day showed 146 acres planted, 312 gallons diesel, 1 bearing replaced, and no borrowed dollars attached to any of it. 3 days later, Trent mailed a revised packet with a higher headline number and a tighter response deadline. Roy filed it in a manila folder marked Land Offers, wrote Received in the upper right corner, and returned to the field before sunrise. 3 mornings after he filed the packet, Roy was back on the bottom ground with the planter folding out against the pale sunrise. river fog still laying in the low spots like thin wool. Trent had given him a deadline in bold red ink. Roy answered with planting depth, seed spacing, and a pencil line in the daily log. By the last week of May 2016, the crop was up evenly enough that even skeptical neighbors admitted the stand looked strong. Roy's ledger for the 220-acre tract was clinical and complete. Seed and treatment, $18,260. Fertility, $31,540. Chemistry, $16,430. Diesel and lubrication allocated by engine hours, $6,180. Repairs and wear parts, $4,920. Crop insurance premium share, $3,940. Miscellaneous hauling and storage, $2,870. Total direct and allocated cost, $84,140. The $92,740 he had signed in March under seed/fertilizer covered broader prepaid input commitments and deposits tied to getting that same bottom ground program in the ground, while the tract ledger reflected the final allocated seed and fertility consumption booked to those 220 acres after true-up. Harvest settlement on 12,760 bushels at a blended $9.47 after basis and quality adjustments came to $120,902. Net contribution from that tract, $36,762. Not glamorous, not speculative, productive and repeatable. He did not isolate the tract from the rest of the farm when making decisions, and that was a central difference in his framework. His whole operation in 2016 finished with $248,370 net after rent on the 160 leased acres, taxes accrued, machinery reserve, and household draw. He moved $110,000 into treasury bills, split across staggered maturities, $60,000 into the land opportunity account, and $22,000 into a repair contingency line he kept separate from both. When a local banker asked why he was holding so much short-term paper with rates still modest, Roy said one sentence: "Liquidity buys patience when prices do not." Trent returned in September with updated brochures and a revised pitch that treated farming as delay. The new offer headline was $3,720,000, with a language about anchor tenants and accelerated permitting. Roy took the envelope, wrote received beside the date, and set it under the first one. He did not argue future land use theory in the co-op parking lot. He was calibrating downside, not chasing narrative. By mid-April 2017, the river had climbed twice after heavy storms west of Cloud County, and low areas on the bottom track stayed saturated long enough to force prevent plant decisions on 38 acres. Roy's numbers for that year looked rough in isolation and healthy in context. Insurance indemnity and harvested acres together produced a net of $41,380 on the tract after cleanup and rework costs. The whole farm still posted $162,440 net because his fixed obligations stayed thin and he had no note payments, demanding cash at the worst possible month. That same year, he bought 40 acres from an estate south of Jamestown at $3,250 per acre, total $130,000, cash at close, no financing contingency, with closing costs of $2,740. He did it without touching operating reserves by redeeming maturing treasury bills and delaying one non-essential shed expansion. Consequently, acreage control rose while risk stayed bounded. He was not anti-growth. He was anti-fragile growth. 2018 brought a cleaner weather window and strong yields. The bottom tract averaged 63 bushels soybeans per acre at a blended cash price of $8.62 and netted $89,114 after full cost allocation and overhead share. Across all owned and rented ground, Roy finished at $219,860 net. He moved $95,000 to reserves, prepaid potassium for the following season, at a discount worth $9.80 per acre across planned acres, and set aside $48,000 for drain tile repairs on 2 fields that had underperformed for 3 seasons. Trent's third packet arrived that winter, now at $3,840,000, and included a schedule showing projected warehouse lease rates 5 years out. Roy filed it with the others and bought soybean inoculant. Let me stop here and ask you something. If you were sitting where Roy sat, would you take one large check tied to approvals you do not control, or keep compounding from land you already understand down to the foot? Put your answer in the comments, then come back to the numbers because they decide this story. In 2019, export pressure and basis collapse cut margins everywhere in the county. On Roy's bottom tract, net fell to $52,006. Many operators read that year as proof that selling to developers was smarter than enduring commodity swings. Roy read it as proof that low fixed costs matter more than high optimism. His whole farm net was $149,720, down but solid. He responded with narrower spending, not fear. Household spending stayed below $30,500. Machinery replacement stayed at zero finance dollars. He rebuilt a hydraulic pump for $1,140 in parts instead of replacing the unit for $7,900 plus labor. The contrast with peers sharpened during those same seasons, and none of it was cartoon simple. Dale Voss was a competent operator on 480 acres who wanted to keep pace with scale and efficiency pressures. In 2018, he refinanced land and equipment into a floating structure totaling $2,180,000. Initial blended rate, 4.6%. Annual debt service target, about $187,000 with interest-only flexibility in 2 years. The first 2 seasons looked manageable. Then rates rose, input costs climbed, and renewals tightened. By 2023, his effective rate exposure was above 8% on portions of the stack, and annual cash obligation moved beyond what his margins could reliably support. Maria Gutierrez and her brother Eli were equally serious and equally hardworking. They guaranteed a $740,000 irrigation expansion at 7.1%, because 2 prior dry years had cut yields enough to threaten tenancy agreements on part of their acres. Their monthly payments at near $8,560 before maintenance and energy. They were not gambling. They were trying to stabilize production. But when another pair of dry seasons hit with weaker commodity pricing, the equipment and power costs that were supposed to protect revenue became a pressure point. Payment delays started with 1 month, then 3. Owen Pike's path was familiar across the region. He borrowed $410,000 for newer iron on a 7-year schedule after repeated breakdowns had cost him planting days. His annual payment burden crossed $73,000 once insurance and service contracts were included. Then diesel climbed, fertilizers surged, and the margin he needed to justify the note vanished. He did not fail from laziness or arrogance. He got trapped between fixed obligations and volatile inputs, the same trap Roy had been studying since 1985. By the first week of October 2020, Basis had improved and yields recovered, and Roy's bottom track produced a net of $133,228. Whole farm net reached $302,610 after all allocations, one of his strongest years since the early 2010s. He did not celebrate with purchases. He rebuilt liquidity. Treasury ladder additions that year totaled $210,000. Tax reserve contribution, $58,000. Opportunistic land account, $70,000. Household draw remained restrained. When neighbors asked why he did not upgrade to a new combine while cash looked strong, he pointed at his ledger line for fixed cost per acre and said, "I protect that line first." In 2021, input inflation returned hard. Fertilizer bids rose quickly, chemical programs tightened, and freight surcharges appeared where they had never been itemized before. The bottom track still cleared $97,440 net. Whole farm net settled at $228,390, respectable, but narrower than 2020. Trent's calls grew more frequent and more urgent. He now spoke about institutional capital waiting on contiguous parcels, and suggested Roy could miss the final premium window. Roy asked one question each time: who carried grading risk if spring weather delayed construction? Trent's answers were long and conditional. 3 days passed before the county started hearing about financing strain inside one of the development partnerships tied to those offers. It came in fragments first, then in recorded filings. Interest-only bridge debt had reset higher than underwriters expected. Contractor bids moved up. Planned timelines drifted. Parcels under option were still under option, but the cushion was thinner. Then 2022 and 2023 brought the full stress test together. Rapid rate hikes, tighter credit standards, and a spring flood that undid weeks of preliminary grading on tracks connected to Trent's expansion pitch. One heavy rain event scoured access work and pooled across low excavated sections, forcing rework costs the partnership had not budgeted. Meanwhile, farm operating lines across the region repriced upward. Renewals that had once been routine became full document underwriting reviews with stricter collateral terms. Roy absorbed his own weather hits without lender intervention. Replant expense on flood-touched acres, $47,860. Additional fuel and custom hauling, due to timing compression, $18,420. Unplanned levee and drainage repairs on 2 boundaries, $63,700. Total shock cost across the cycle, $129,980. He paid from cash reserves and still entered winter with $684,000 in liquid positions between treasury maturities and insured money market balances. No term debt, no forced asset sales, no emergency refinancing meetings. Dale did not get that runway. In February 2023, after extended negotiations, his lender initiated foreclosure on core collateral parcels. The legal process moved through summer. He lost land control and both financed combines at auction values below what everyone in the room wished they had brought. Maria and Eli negotiated forbearance twice, sold 2 non-core assets, and still could not keep the irrigation note current through the second dry season. Owen sold machinery first, then custom hired harvest to finish commitments while restructuring what remained. Each of them was treated in town with respect by people who understood the same weather, and rate shocks could have broken almost anyone with enough leverage. Roy did not posture as vindication. He called Dale once to ask whether his family needed short-term help with utilities during the legal process. He asked Maria and Eli what acreage they could still farm efficiently if they resized. He offered Owen a lease conversation after harvest if terms could be made fair on both sides. The resulting tension in the county was not about personality. It was about arithmetic under stress, and arithmetic was unforgiving. By May 2024, the bypass talk had gone from certainty to caution. Contractors wanted stronger guarantees. Lenders wanted revised equity commitments. Option language started colliding with financing covenants. Trent still wore pressed shirts and still drove a clean pickup, but his calls had changed tone. Less urgency, more qualifiers. Roy listened, made no speeches, and went back to the planner as river moisture held exactly where he had said it would 8 years earlier. At dusk one evening that month, he parked the 1997 Ford beside the shop, rust glowing dull red in the low light, and updated the ledger with a line he had used for decades when markets were noisy and choices were expensive. Preserve optionality. Then he circled the current liquid reserve figure, closed the book, and set it beside a folder of land offer packets that had grown thick enough to need a second clip. Roy logged Preserve Optionality at the end of May 2024, closed the ledger, and carried that thick folder into the Cloud County Clerk office for a routine parcel verification tied to drainage easements, where Trent Halverson happened to be standing at the same counter with a surveyor and a lender representative from Wichita. Trent had expected another procedural delay. What he got was a map. The deputy clerk pulled the ownership layer, toggled tax parcels, and printed 3 oversized sheets. Roy did not comment while the pages came off the machine. Parcel by parcel, section by section, the mosaic connected. Mercer Farms in Roy's name, Mercer Family Trust in a companion filing, and long-held tracts that bordered the disputed bottom ground on 3 sides. When the surveyor totaled the contiguous control, the number landed at 1,420 acres. Trent asked for a correction. The clerk rechecked legal descriptions, then read the same number again. Roy asked for 1 additional print showing historical transfer dates. The clerk added that too. 38 years of accumulation sat in black text: estate purchase closings, tax sale confirmations, private party warranty deeds, each one small enough at the time to escape attention. Average basis across those 1,420 acres, using Roy's own ledger and closing statements he provided for verification, came to $2,940 per acre. Total basis, $4,174,800. County valuation and recent arm's-length comparables put current market ranges near $8,900 to $9,600 per acre, depending on water and access, which implied land value around $12.6 million to $13.6 million before transaction costs. The lender representative, who had come expecting to discuss development timelines, asked Roy whether those parcels were encumbered. Roy handed over a 1-page schedule prepared by his accountant. Operating note, none. Equipment notes, none. Term debt on owned land, none. Lease obligations, annual cash rent on 160 acres, current and paid. Liquid reserves as of the prior month end, $684,000 in treasury bills, and insured cash equivalents. Trent looked at the sheet, then at Roy's patched cuff and faded cap, and for the first time in 8 years, his sales language stopped mid-sentence. A primary consideration had been hidden in plain sight. Trent had pitched a single premium check on 220 acres at $3.6 million to $3.84 million. Roy had been running a debt-free operating system that, according to accountant-prepared summaries filed for insurance and estate planning, had generated $4.12 million cumulative net cash flow since 1998 after direct costs, rent, maintenance, and household draws. The track Trent wanted was not Roy's escape route. It was one component of an integrated, low-risk machine. 3 days after that clerk office meeting, word moved through co-op coffee circles without any boasting from Roy. He had not corrected anyone publicly. The numbers had done it for him. Summer settled over the county with that arithmetic still circulating, and by July 2024, the financing strain inside the development partnership had turned formal. Court filings in Reno County confirmed a default on interest-only bridge debt tied to assembled parcels near the proposed expansion corridor. The supervising judge ordered a public sale on 300 acres of adjacent tract under structured auction terms. Certified funds required, proof of liquidity before final round, close within 21 days. Trent entered on behalf of a reorganized buyer group. Roy entered in person, alone, in the same 1997 Ford. The morning of the auction was hot and still. Roy parked between a late-model sport utility vehicle and a dealer-plated half-ton, stepped out in those same stitched boots, and carried a plain envelope with bank verification and a certified check instrument line pre-authorized up to $2,300,000. Trent wore a pressed blue shirt and spoke quietly with counsel near the registration table. Neither man staged a confrontation. They signed in, took bidder cards, and waited for the clerk to call opening terms. Bidding started at $6,100 per acre and advanced in measured increments. At $6,900, 2 local groups dropped out. At $7,150, Trent raised once and paused for lender confirmation. At $7,300, Roy nodded and held. The auctioneer asked for $7,350. Trent requested a recess to clear revised covenant language with his bank contact. The recess lasted 11 minutes. When proceedings resumed, Trent's group was ruled non-compliant with same-day liquidity documentation under the court order. Their bidder status ended there. Roy stood as final qualified bidder at $7,300 per acre, total purchase price $2,190,000 for 300 acres. He did not smile for cameras. He signed the purchase memorandum, confirmed close date, and asked for the water right transfer packet. The generosity began less than an hour later in the hallway outside the courtroom, and it followed the same structured discipline as his farming. Maria and Eli had attended as observers, not bidders. Roy asked whether they would meet at his truck tailgate with a notepad. He offered to sell them 40 acres from the newly acquired tract at $5,200 per acre, total $208,000, on a zero-interest 10-year note with annual payments of $20,800, first payment due after first harvest, no prepayment penalty, and one covenant. They would maintain terraces, waterways, and soil test records. Market value that day was $7,300 per acre, so the embedded transfer discount was $84,000 before financing benefit. At zero interest, they also avoided roughly $74,600 in interest expense. A conventional 7.0% note would have imposed over 10 years. Combined advantage, about $158,600 of breathing room. Maria cried once quietly, then asked the only question Roy expected. "If we have a bad year?" Roy answered in 8 words. "Call early, adjust timing, keep the ground healthy." Eli signed a letter of intent that afternoon. Closing was scheduled after title were cleared. Roy's second move addressed collapse fallout directly. Dale Voss still faced a legal deficiency balance after foreclosure proceedings, and the remaining claim threatened his family's home equity. Roy had his attorney wire $250,000 into a court-supervised settlement account with one condition: full deficiency release and lien satisfaction filed within 10 business days. The filing posted on day 8. Dale kept the house. He took a planner-operator position with a regional custom crew at $31.50 per hour plus seasonal overtime, and for the first time in 2 years he could budget forward without legal notices arriving in stacks. Owen Pike's restructuring also moved from emergency to terms on paper. After the 2023 machinery sell-down, he completed an August 2024 workout that re-amortized remaining equipment debt under tighter covenants, leased peak season capacity instead of buying, and stabilized cash flow enough to keep his core acres in production. The third move was designed as multiplier, not rescue theater. Roy established a beginning farmer equipment grant pool of $180,000, administered through the local extension committee with published criteria and quarterly reporting. 4 recipients were selected in September 2024 after blind review of operating plans and debt schedules. Kira Benson received $48,000 for a used planter and row unit rebuild on 210 leased acres. Nathan Cole received $42,000 for a grain cart and dryer efficiency retrofit on 340 acres. Luke and Hannah Erb received $50,000 for no-till drill and residue management tools on 280 acres. Javier Mendez received $40,000 for sprayer upgrade and nurse tank safety package on 190 acres. Grant terms required matching savings at a minimum ratio of $1 saved for each $2, granted over 36 months, plus annual mentorship hours logged with established operators. No speeches, just documents, transfers, and deadlines. Within 4 months, measurable outcomes appeared. Kira cut planning delay risk and reduced custom hire expense by $19,400 in her first full season. Nathan lowered post-harvest moisture penalties and improved basis timing enough to add $23,700 gross margin. The herbs reduced passes and fuel use, saving $14,200 while protecting residue cover on fragile slopes. Javier's application efficiency reduced overuse and drift-related loss, trimming per-acre chemistry cost by $11.80 across his program. Roy reviewed their quarterly reports at his kitchen table, marked 2 lines in red where assumptions looked too optimistic, and returned the packets with short notes in the margin. By the second week of November, he added one more layer. He seeded a revolving beginning farmer fund with $600,000, held at a local community bank under conservative lending covenants. Maximum debt-to-asset threshold for borrowers, required working capital floor, and mandatory crop insurance. The initial annual disbursement cap was set at $120,000 to preserve durability through weaker years. Roy insisted on that cap despite pressure to move faster. He had spent 40 years proving that pace matters as much as intention. The deeper arithmetic, when decomposed, explained why he could act at that scale without threatening his own operation. Analysts who later reviewed his books for a farm transition seminar used a simple comparison framework. Scenario 1. Sell the 220-acre bottom tract in 2016 for $3,600,000, pay estimated combined taxes and transaction friction near 24%, leaving approximately $2,736,000 deployable. Then invest in a blended portfolio at assumed 5.0% after fees with periodic draw needs. Scenario 2. Keep farming debt-free. Retain land control and compound operating margins, plus appreciation. Roy's actual path produced tract-level net contributions from 2016 through projected 2024 harvest that totaled about $710,000 even, with flood and replant hits. More importantly, whole farm net cash generation across that period remained stable enough to preserve purchasing power and flexibility, culminating in the 300-acre acquisition at distressed auction pricing. That purchase alone created immediate paper spread. Bought at $7,300 per acre in a region with stronger long-run comparables, while simultaneously allowing below-market transfer to Maria and Eli, without weakening Roy's balance sheet. The machinery line told a parallel story that experts in the room found hard to ignore. Roy's repaired fleet and disciplined replacement philosophy held machinery capital burden around $38 per acre. Peer operations on financed replacement cycles averaged about $122 per acre. Spread, $84 per acre. Apply that spread across an average 875 acres managed over 20 years, and the cumulative difference is $1,470,000. That is not theory. That is a line item multiplied by time. His living cost discipline added another non-trivial buffer. Household expenses that had stayed near the high 20,000 to low 30,000 range prevented cash leakage during strong commodity years. Every dollar not converted into lifestyle, fixed cost, became reserve capacity, and reserve capacity became optionality when rates rose and credit narrowed. By early December 2024, the county's prevailing consensus had shifted. The man in patched overalls had not merely been right about one offer. He had built a framework where refusing leverage preserved agency, and preserved agency allowed him to stabilize other families when the cycle turned. At dusk, he was back in the shop with the 4430, grease gun in hand, writing fuel and repair entries in pencil while legal filings, grant reports, and payment schedules sat clipped beside the ledger that had guided every step. On that same bench, beside the grease gun and the pencil-stained ledger, lay the first signed acceptance letters from the 4 grant recipients, and Roy treated those pages the way he treated machinery manuals, not as ceremony, but as operating instructions. Each packet had a budget, a debt schedule, a maintenance plan, and a 1-page risk note in Roy's hand. Kira Benson had circled her largest threat as delayed planting on rented ground with narrow weather windows. Nathan Cole had marked drying losses and basis penalties as the 2 leaks draining margin every season. Luke and Hannah Erb had written one sentence in block letters: keep residue, keep soil, keep terms. Javier Mendez had listed sprayer downtime as his most expensive hidden cost because every delay forced either custom rates or yield drag. By the end of January 2025, the first disbursements had cleared, and the Extension Committee posted a public ledger in the courthouse hallway. Kira drew $24,000 in Phase 1, matched with $12,300 from her own savings, and purchased a used 12-row planter bar plus row unit kits. Nathan drew $21,000 and paired it with $10,900 to install a variable speed fan upgrade and burner controls on an older dryer. The Herbs drew $25,000 with $13,400, match for a no-till drill, and residue managers. Javier drew $20,000 with $11,200 match for a sprayer and nurse tank containment package. The second half of each grant stayed contingent on record-keeping and cost control targets. Their spring numbers began proving the design. Kira's planting pace rose from an average of 62 acres per day to 91, and custom hire expense dropped from $31,600 to $12,200. Nathan's average drying cost per bushel fell from 43 cents to 28 cents, and he sold 38% of his crop in stronger basis windows because he could hold grain without quality anxiety. Luke and Hannah cut field passes by 2 on soybean acres, lowered diesel use by 1,180 gallons, and improved infiltration on the slope ground they had been losing sleep over. Javier reduced overlap losses and chemistry waste by enough to lower direct chemical cost $11.80 per acre across 190 acres in his first season. Dale Voss's trajectory moved slower, but it moved. His deficiency release was recorded, stamped, and mailed in a thick envelope that arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in February 2025. He read it twice at his kitchen table before calling Roy, and Roy kept that call to practical terms. Now build cash first. Dale took the precision planter operator role full-time, averaging 58 to 72 hours per week in season, and directed overtime straight into a reserve account. Gross wages in 2025 were $84,960, including seasonal differentials. He lived on $49,300, paid taxes, and finished the year with $21,400 in cash savings, the first positive year-end balance he had seen in too long. Maria and Eli closed on their 40 acres in March 2025 after title work cleared one easement correction. Their annual zero-interest note payment was fixed at $20,800. They made that first payment in full after harvest, plus an extra principal payment of $4,000 because soybean yields on the tract came in above their conservative budget. Their operating statement that year showed modest profit, then better traction in 2026, as irrigation planning became more disciplined and less debt-dependent. In 2027, they posted their first clearly profitable year after all costs, taxes, and family draw, with net farm income of $96,300 and no late payments. They framed the paid note receipt copy and hung it near the office door, not for display to visitors, but as a reminder to themselves. Owen Pike accepted Roy's lease proposal on 120 acres at a fair cash rent indexed to local averages with one protective clause. If diesel or fertilizer crossed defined thresholds, rent timing could flex without penalties so operating cash did not break in June. Owen sold his remaining high-payment machinery, shifted to a smaller owned core, and hired seasonal custom work where ownership made no sense. In 2025, he returned to black ink by $34,700. In 2026, he cleared $61,200 and rebuilt working capital to a level his lender had been asking for since before the spike years. If you are learning something from this pattern, pass it along to someone who still thinks generosity and discipline cannot exist in the same set of books. The multiplier effect became visible by acreage, then by balance sheets. By harvest 2026, the 4 grant recipients collectively managed 1,980 acres. Their combined debt-to-asset ratios stayed below 22%, with Kira at 19.4, Nathan at 21.7, the Herbs at 17.9, and Javier at 20.8. They had agreed to Roy's one covenant, beyond paperwork: help the next person once you can. In 2026, they contributed a combined $46,000 to the Beginning Farmer Revolving Fund. The fund, seeded at $600,000, earned modest interest, recycled repayments, and kept annual disbursements within the $120,000 cap Roy said at the start, slow enough to survive weak years, large enough to matter. Trent Halverson's resolution was quieter than his entrance had been. Through the first half of 2025, he tried to keep the Hutchinson office open while restructuring commission obligations from the failed expansion corridor deals. He negotiated extensions, reduced staff, and took on smaller listings, but the pipeline that had been built around leverage-heavy development could not carry fixed overhead once lenders shifted standards. In September 2025, he closed the office, sold the branded half-ton, and accepted a salaried land analyst role with a regional advisory firm that specialized in farm transition planning. People expected him to disappear or defend old assumptions. He did neither. He started showing clients side-by-side models that included rate sensitivity, covenant risk, infrastructure delays, tax friction, and opportunity cost of losing productive ground. In one county workshop, he used Roy's public numbers, with permission and without names on recipient data, to show how a lower leverage path preserved family control through volatile cycles. He did not call himself wrong in dramatic terms. He changed his framework and let that stand as his admission. The last unresolved thread between him and Roy closed in a short phone call in late 2025. Trent asked if the old land offer packets were still on file for a case study timeline. Roy said yes, then mailed copies marked expired, withdrawn, or not accepted, each with date and disposition. Physical evidence accounted for, archived, and done. By the second week of February 2026, Roy's accountant completed year-end statements and slid them across the same kitchen table that had carried decades of penciled decisions. Estimated net worth, $11.3 million, driven by land value, retained liquidity, and zero term debt. Household spending for the year, $31,740. Power and heat had risen, medical premiums were higher, and truck maintenance took more than usual. Yet total living costs stayed controlled because he never converted a good year into permanent personal overhead. The bottom land remained in soybeans and rotation corn exactly as planned. No warehouses, no speculative grading contracts, just production, timing, and risk kept inside clear limits. The roll call in Cloud County read like a ledger balanced at last. Roy Mercer still farmed, still drove the 1997 Ford, with rusted panels and a chain on the tailgate hinge, and still logged fuel and yields in pencil. Dale Voss still ran precision planting passes each spring and had built savings past $60,000 by late 2026, with no deficiency notice attached to his name. Maria Gutierrez and Eli Gutierrez were current on every payment, profitable in 2027, and negotiating one additional lease from retained earnings rather than borrowed optimism. Owen Pike still farmed, leaner and steadier, with 120 leased acres from Roy and a cost structure that could absorb a poor basis year without panic. Kira Benson expanded to 460 managed acres by partnering on equipment time-sharing instead of buying duplicate iron. Nathan Cole renegotiated storage terms and cut post-harvest losses enough to fund his own dryer maintenance reserve. Luke and Hannah Erb kept erosion down and soil organic matter trending up on fields local renters had once mined hard. Javier Mendez completed safety certifications and began doing limited custom spraying, adding service revenue without loading his balance sheet with a new debt. Walter Keene's daughter, who had chosen certainty over a higher nominal offer years earlier, remained in touch through holiday cards and one handwritten note after reading about the fund contributions. She wrote that her father would have recognized the method immediately. Pay on time, keep promises, leave ground better than you found it. Even the folder marked land offers received a final line in Roy's record system by mid-2026. Each proposal was indexed with outcome notes and filed under closed opportunities, not as trophies, not as warnings, just completed decisions with documented reasons. The clerk office maps that had stunned people 2 years earlier were now part of routine estate planning documents. Nothing hidden, nothing performative. By Harvest 2027, the local Beginning Farmer Fund had completed another cycle of disbursements and repayments without a single default. The County Extension Board, initially cautious, adopted Roy's underwriting template for its own pilot support program. Combined acreage under participating operators increased. Average leverage remained moderate, and equipment purchases shifted toward used and rebuilt units where economics penciled out. The philosophy had moved from one man's habits into community practice because the arithmetic held under pressure. If you want more stories where numbers beat noise, subscribe now. Then leave a comment with this specific question. Which single fixed cost in your operation would you cut first to preserve optionality? Share this with one person who looks broke from the road but pays every bill on time because they may be building the strongest balance sheet in the county. At dusk, on an evening with a thin west wind and dust lifting low across the yard, Roy set a pan under the 4430, checked a fitting, and gave the grease gun 2 careful strokes. The tractor was 53 years old and field ready. The truck nearby had more miles than anyone guessed and no payment book in the glove box. Inside, the ledger lay open to a clean line waiting for ink. He wrote date, fuel, acres, moisture, and one note at the margin where he had written it for years, preserve optionality. The farmer who looked poorest was richest, not because he chased a headline number, but because he kept control long enough to turn private discipline into public stability. He tore the receipt slip from the ledger ring, set it beside the open page, and heard gravel crack under tires at the end of the lane. It was Maria and Eli in a white pickup with a cracked mirror and a seed tender behind it, both of them still in work clothes, both carrying a long envelope that had been folded and unfolded all day. They did not stand on ceremony. Maria put the envelope on the kitchen table and said, "Second payment and extra principal." Roy opened it, counted once, and wrote the line item in pencil. Annual note payment, $20,800. Additional principal, $6,000. Remaining balance, $156,400. Eli slid over a second sheet, their field-by-field report. 40 acres from Roy had averaged 61 bushels soybeans at a net of $318 per acre after direct costs, then 182 bushels corn on rotation acres, where they had corrected compaction and reduced pass count. Total farm net for their 2027 year, after family draw and taxes accrued, was $96,300, exactly what they had projected in winter, with one difference. They had cut repair downtime by 37 machine hours because they quit pushing worn parts through one more pass. Roy circled that number, tapped it with the eraser, and said, "Downtime is a bill, too." 3 days later, the revolving fund committee met in the extension room at 7 o'clock in the morning, coffee in paper cups, no speeches, one legal pad in the center of the table. Kira Benson arrived first with 2 binders and an invoice stack sorted by month. Her 460 managed acres had produced gross revenue of $742,180 in 2027 with net operating income of $141,260. She deposited $12,000 to the revolving fund and set aside $18,400 in her own machinery reserve, meeting both grant covenants ahead of schedule. Nathan Cole came in next, smelling faintly of propane and grain dust, and reported that his dryer retrofit had cut average shrink and moisture penalties enough to add $27,940 to margin over baseline. He contributed $11,500 to the fund and prepaid his own off-season maintenance in cash. Luke and Hannah Erb arrived together with color-coded soil maps and one page that mattered most: erosion control compliance at 100% on the slopes that had worried them 2 years earlier. Fuel use was down 1,310 gallons year over year. Repair expense was up $4,200 after a toolbar failure, but fieldwork stayed on schedule because they had built a parts shelf instead of waiting on emergency shipments. Their contribution was $10,400. Javier Mendez closed the circle with a clean audit trail on spray logs, no drift claims, and a side business of 3,200 custom acres that generated $68,700 gross on a lean cost structure. He put in $12,100. Committee total for the year sat at $46,000 again, matching the prior cycle, and the fund balance after disbursements, repayments, and interest posted at $655,840. At that same table, Dale Voss took the seat nearest the door and unfolded his first full personal budget, not written under legal pressure. Precision planning wages for 2027 had reached $89,420, including seasonal overtime. Household and transport ran $52,110. Tax and insurance accrual, $14,900. Annual savings transfer, $22,410. Cash reserve at year-end, $83,020. He asked Roy whether he should chase a larger planter ownership share offered by a friend. Roy looked at the fixed cost line, then asked one question: what happens in a wet spring? Dale looked down for a long second, nodded, and wrote decline in the margin. He took a smaller step instead, a $9,800 ownership stake in a cooperative tender system with no debt attached. By the first week of April 2028, Owen Pike backed into Roy's yard with his lease file in a plastic binder and a fair offer already penciled. They sat on the tailgate of the 1997 Ford, chain still holding the right hinge square, and worked through terms line by line. Base rent stayed aligned with county averages. Timing flexibility remained tied to input spikes, and a new clause rewarded documented soil improvement with a modest rent credit capped at $12 per acre. Owen signed, then handed Roy a one-page statement from his accountant. 2027 net, $64,480. Working capital ratio above lender threshold for the first time since before the spike years. Black ink 2 years running, he said. Roy answered, protect it. Trent Halverson's final turn came in a room he used to avoid, the county workshop hall where producers asked hard questions and expected direct arithmetic. On a windy Thursday in June 2028, he stood in front of 47 landowners as a salaried analyst. No glossy brochures, no urgency clock on a slide. He projected 2 models on a plain screen. Model A was leverage-heavy conversion with approval risk, timing drift, and bridge rate exposure. Model B was lower leverage transition with retained productive acres and staggered liquidity. He walked through rate sensitivity at 4%, 7%, and 9%, then paused and said, I used to sell speed. Speed can hide fragility. Durability is slower and usually safer. Roy sat in the back row with his cap in his lap. After the session, Trent crossed the aisle, held out his hand, and kept his words short. "I read your numbers wrong." Roy shook once and said, "You changed your method. That matters." The unresolved look from the co-op years earlier, that half-second where Trent had stopped mid-sentence at the clerk counter, was no longer a question. It was answered in public, with spreadsheets instead of excuses. The old physical trail was closed with the same care. In August 2028, Roy met his accountant and the deputy clerk to finalize archive copies of every land offer packet from 2016 through 2024. Each document carried a disposition stamp: expired, withdrawn, superseded, or declined. The original manila folder, once thick with revised numbers and red deadlines, went into a fireproof cabinet in Roy's office. Scanned copies were indexed in the estate file, and the clerk entered reference notes for future title reviewers. No dangling papers, no mystery files. By harvest 2028, Cloud County measured the ripple in practical terms rather than sentiment. The 4 original grant recipients and 2 second-cycle borrowers from the revolving fund collectively managed 2,340 acres. Combined debt-to-asset ratio stayed under 24%. Combined annual contribution to the fund rose to $58,300. The Extension Board's pilot, built from Roy's underwriting template, posted 0 defaults through its first full year. At the same board table, Roy finally said the quiet part out loud. What started in 1985 as his father's foreclosure lesson was no longer just family memory. It now lived in written covenants, stress-tested underwriting, and county training for the next generation. Roy's books for 2028 closed with the same handwriting and nearly the same household discipline that had surprised people 20 years earlier. Net worth estimate moved above $11.6 million with no term debt. Household spending finished at $32,180 despite higher utilities and medical premiums. The 220 bottom acres remained in rotation, soybeans after corn, with drainage work maintained and fertility adjusted to soil tests rather than dealer bundles. The 4430 stayed in service, hours logged, grease points marked, capital cost still a fraction of financed replacement schedules. Every named life in this story had a settled line by then. Roy Mercer still farmed and still chose control over display. Trent Halverson still worked in land, now as the analyst who warned families where leverage could break them. Dale Voss still ran planners each spring and built savings without legal shadows. Maria Gutierrez and Eli Gutierrez stayed current on every 0 interest payment and added 1 lease from retained earnings. Owen Pike kept 120 leased acres from Roy and protected his working capital through 2 volatile input seasons. Kira Benson, Nathan Cole, Luke and Hannah Erb, and Javier Mendez all remained active operators, all met their covenants, all helped fund the next group. At dusk in late October 2028, with a thin west wind moving chaff along the yard, Roy rolled the 4430 into the shop and shut it down at idle. The engine clicked as it cooled. The Ford sat outside with rust on the rocker panels and that same chain on the tailgate hinge. He washed his hands, opened the ledger, and entered the day. Fuel gallons, acres cut, moisture, basis, repair parts ordered, checks cleared. Then he wrote one final line for the page, not as a slogan, just a control setting that had outlived rumors, rates, and offers. Preserve optionality. That was the whole parable in working clothes. The man who looked stretched thin had reserves. The man in patched overalls had liquidity. The farm that seemed old was structurally modern where it counted. in risk design, cost discipline, and patient capital. He turned one refused fortune into recurring harvests, then turned those harvests into other families' second starts. Numbers carried the proof. Character carried the method. The lights in the shop went out, and the ledger stayed open to tomorrow.